morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Merzlach, Editor-in-Chief of U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings magazine. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this morning's panel, Manned and Unmanned Systems, What is the Right Mix? And I think it probably goes without saying that unmanned systems, drones and such are ubiquitous now in operations and in warfare. In fact, I think a day doesn't go by where you don't see a headline that contains the words drone strikes, usually accompanied by Afghanistan or Pakistan or something like that. So, you know, there's certainly no going back. It's a part of our arsenal now. And it's raised a number of questions, I think, that will be discussed this morning among our distinguished panelists, and, you know, some things to chew on. And, you know, General Dempsey actually, I thought, mentioned a few of them this morning, although I appreciated his remark as a former Air Force guy when he mentioned that the Air Force was afraid of losing not only the planes but the scarves as well. You know, perhaps that'll come up later, perhaps not. But I would say the more interesting aspect, which perhaps isn't discussed as often, but I hope people are thinking about, is what could happen, how vulnerable could UAVs be here on the home front? We always think of what's going on at the receiving end, but could our drone capability, our unmanned capability, be taken down by a strike here at home on our power grid, as General Dempsey mentioned, and certainly something to think about. I think it also goes on to affect other sorts of procurement decisions. Certainly, if you want to look at it from a sea services point of view, what kind of impact does that have on any kind of shipbuilding plans if you're going to configure them differently for unmanned systems? Other things, you know, who flies UAVs at what level? You know, how far down does the responsibility go? And of course, you know, at what how are they affected by those operations? You've seen stories of possible post-traumatic stress disorder, other issues that have come up. At any rate, that's what our panel is going to look at today, led by its moderator, Captain George Galderisi, who is a career naval aviator and also an accomplished author and regular contributor to our Proceedings magazine, first writing for us in 1978. During his Navy career, he had 4 command tours and 5 years as a Carrier Strike Group Chief of Staff. He has written 7 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Tom Clancy Presents Act of Valor, the novelization of the very popular Bandito Brothers film starring U.S. Navy SEALs. His most recent book, published by our Naval Institute Press, is The Kissing Sailor. He's also written over 200 articles in professional journals and other media, and his most recent article for Proceedings appeared in December 2011. He co-authored a piece on UAVs titled More Brains, Less Brawn, which called for making unmanned systems smarter. He is currently corporate strategy, director of the Corporate Strategy Group at the Navy's C4ISR Center of Excellence in San Diego. It's my great pleasure to introduce friend and colleague George Galderisi.
No, thanks, Paul, for that far too kind introduction. When our skipper at SSC Pacific introduces me for our brief visitors, he says, now you're going to hear from a knuckle-dragging Navy helicopter pilot on a closely supervised work-release program. So this is a big step up, so thank you for that. Also like to thank FC and the Naval Institute for putting this panel together and bringing us all here to talk about a subject which, quite frankly, we all feel very passionately about. So I appreciate you all being here for this. As General Dubia said in the plenary session, there's no second collection today. There's seats up front in the church, so if you're standing in the back and you feel like sitting down and being closer to the panelists, then please take advantage of that. So as you know, and as you've heard from our keynote speakers, especially the chairman this morning, as well as from our 3 prior panels, this is an important topic, And as you've heard and understand from the theme of this year's conference, Joint and Coalition Forces Inflection Point, what to hold and what to fold, discussions on that topic so far this week have been, in a word, spirited. And in this morning's panel, Manned and Unmanned Systems, What's the Right Mix?, we'll continue that spirited discussion, and if we do it right, perhaps take it to the next level. Your conference organizers have assembled a panel with just the right mix of background, talent, and expertise, and one that is joint in every sense of the word, to do just that and examine this issue of extraordinary importance to the joint force. What's the right mix of manned and unmanned systems, or more properly, autonomous systems in joint warfighting today and tomorrow? And this isn't some fluffy or vague or wonky question. It's a real and compelling one. You might have heard about a number recently, 487. What's that? $487 billion is the amount the defense budget will be cut over the next 10 years. The Department of Defense and the Joint Force are no longer in a position to buy lots of everything. And as good stewards of taxpayers' dollars, these civilian and military leaders, like the chairman, are having to make huge trade-offs today regarding what the services buy and don't buy to support today's and tomorrow's joint warfighters. And without putting too fine a point on it, advocates of manned and unmanned systems are often passionate, and some would even say shrill, about their system being the better way to go. So what about manned and unmanned systems? Let's look at it from the air perspective for a moment, because that's what seems to come to mind first when folks discuss this topic, and for good reason. Manned flight's been around since the morning of December 17, 1903, when Orville Wright soared 20 feet above the windswept beach of Kitty Hawk, and military manned flight began soon after that. And unmanned military flight has been around for, well, a half century longer than that. As Casey Stengel famously said, you could look it up. The earliest recorded use of unmanned aerial vehicle for warfighting occurred on August 22, 1849, when the Austrians attacked the Italian city of Venice with unmanned balloons loaded with explosives. And despite the persistent view among some that unmanned systems in the U.S. military is something very new, their use actually dates back to the Civil War, when both Union and Confederate forces launched balloons loaded with explosives with the intention that they land inside a supply or ammunition depot and explode. But as the Deputy Director of DoD's Unmanned Warfare Directorate said with understated elegance, it wasn't terribly effective. But the technology progressed, and the first pilotless aircraft were built shortly after World War I. The U.S. Army led the way, commissioning a project to build an aerial torpedo, resulting in the Kettering bug, which was developed for wartime use but wasn't deployed in time to see service in World War I. And there's a rich history moving forward, but that's not what we're here today to talk about, that history. It's not hyperbole to say we've come a long way indeed with unmanned systems. Consider some basic stats. According to the Congressional Research Service, DoD's unmanned aircraft inventory has increased more than 40-fold from 2002 to 2010. DoD's spending on unmanned systems has increased from $284 million in fiscal year 2000 to $3.8 billion in the President's most recent budget. Also, according to Congressional Research Service, due to the recent acceleration of unmanned system production and drawdowns in manned aircraft have gone from 95% of DoD aircraft in 2005 to 59% today. Some pretty compelling stats. And some of you stationed or serve in the Washington, D.C. area may have been at the event less than a week ago at National Defense University. Again, a place we think of as a very strategy and policy-oriented organization. They hosted a full-day event on unmanned systems, widely attended by over 200 people, widely reported in the press. That gives you some indication of the importance today. And then finally, for those of you in industry, you might have noticed that only a few years ago, stories about unmanned systems were mainly carried in the defense press. Now they're everywhere. And by everywhere, I mean in Bloomberg, in Forbes, and other business-related magazines, because this truly is big business, as you know. So perhaps enough for me. The key role of a moderator is to be moderate. You want to hear from our four expert panelists. Why? Given the professional backgrounds of the over 4,000 people who've registered for this event, I'd wager that all of us have an opinion on the right mix of manned and unmanned systems, but our panelists each have a well-nuanced and informed opinion on this very compelling issue. Not only that, but they come from vastly differing backgrounds. So since we're in the heart of baseball season, here's our batting order. I'll introduce each panelist who will share his unique perspectives on the right mix of manned and unmanned systems, and then we'll go right down the line with the panelists as you see them seated here, with each panelist speaking for about 5 minutes. Then we'll offer them a chance to have a dialogue among the panelists and ask each other questions or pile on to what the other person has said. So if that's okay with you all, let's play ball. First up is Dr. Norman Friedman. Dr. Friedman is no stranger to FC and the Naval Institute conferences, or to conferences nationally and internationally for that matter, and is well known to many of you here. He's published widely and written compellingly on a host of important military topics, including manned and unmanned systems. Perhaps most importantly for this panel, at this event, his recent book, Unmanned Combat Air Systems, A New Kind of Carrier Aviation, is widely read and increasingly widely cited and promises to be a classic in this crucial area. I can think of no one better equipped to ignite a spirited discussion on this topic than Dr. Norman Friedman. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Friedman.
Thank you very much, and thanks for coming. Most of the things that you see in the UAV world are relatively small or low performance. They're designed, low performance but long range. They're designed for reconnaissance. They give small units something they didn't have before, which is their own private air, which allows them to see beyond the horizon, which allows them to act much more effectively. I'm going to talk to you about something else. The question for the budget is what to cut and how to save money. People cost a lot of money. There's no way out of that. If you look at shipbuilding, which I know a lot about, if you look at one of the big drivers over, let's say, the last 30 or 40 years, it's an attempt to cut people. That's why we have gas turbines in ships. That's why you have unmanned weapons. That's why you have vertical launchers, actually. In the air world, the single most expensive person is the pilot. And the real question is, will the need to cut money, which means cutting people, always, will that mean that we're forced into thinking more seriously about whether pilots are always needed? When are they needed? When are they not? When is their judgment so important that you would be out of your mind to give them up? Now, you can have a UAV with a pilot who's remotely located, who may be telling the thing what to do all the time. That's like having a pilot. He's in less danger, which means he'll survive longer, but he still costs because he's a real pilot. He's a real person. If you look at a different sort of UAV, look at cruise missiles. If you look at George's examples of past unmanned vehicles, you notice they were mostly cruise missiles? What's a UAV? One way to look at it is a cruise missile that comes back, right? Well, so then the question is, well, if you can do that, do you really need a human being flying this thing all the time? And the answer is probably no. You don't have people flying Tomahawks all the time, do you? Where's the people? Do you have these things autonomously deciding that that thing is bad, I'll blow that up, and then you find out later it blew up a school? Well, actually, in the missile world, there is a person. It's whoever decides how to target the missile. He just doesn't happen to be writing the missile. And if you look at what network-centric has meant, another thing I care about, you'll discover that more and more targets are designated not by the man in the cockpit, but by somebody at a forward operations area where he has a lot of intelligence information in front of him. If the future of war is ambiguous things like Afghanistan and Iraq, then judgment is going to matter more and more and more. It's going to be easier and easier to make mistakes on flash judgment. People aren't going to be wearing obvious uniforms. There aren't going to be a lot of vehicles marked up as, I am an enemy, kill me if you can, right? It'll be more and more difficult to say, if you blow up that building, you'll get the high command of this nasty terrorist organization. That isn't the judgment you make in a cockpit. That's a judgment that someone makes, not back in Washington, in a forward area with a lot of intelligence information available, and possibly other people available to say, oh, no, George, you didn't get it right. That's the mosque, that's their headquarters. Well, isn't that a world in which you want missiles that you can retrieve and refly? Don't you want things that don't get tired? And it seems to me that that's why we should be pushed towards large, high-performance UAVs that look an awful lot like manned aircraft. Will it happen? There are other factors. I would think that under intense financial pressure, a lot of the factors of normal judgment will be pushed aside. We haven't had this kind of problem for a long time. If you want to know when it was last around, it was right after World War II. If you go back to the late 1940s, there was a horrible crisis in American defense. There was a lot less money because actually defense money went into NATO, which made perfectly good sense. In that crisis, it wasn't, well, this is a good idea, this is a better idea, let's mix them up, we're not sure how it works. It was, oh my God, we're going to have to go for the cheapest, most radical thing we can. Actually, we went for a heavy dependence on strategic nuclear. Didn't work out that well. We had Korea instead. But that's the kind of pressure that we're going to be under. And this time, I hope we're luckier. I think that it will push us towards unmanned vehicles on a much larger scale. By the way, the money you save by going in that direction is unbelievable. You save on training, you save on aircraft that are normally held back so that pilots can fly often enough that they remain good. If we do that on a large scale, that probably makes it possible for us to keep other elements of the force which are kind of valuable, like the carriers. And with that, I'll say, you know, you can throw tomatoes at me afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. Our next panelist brings a different perspective to this issue. Brigadier General Peter Gersten, U.S. Air Force, is Director of Plans and Programs, Headquarters, U.S. Air Force Air Combat Command. In this capacity, he's responsible for planning and programming over $29 billion each year to enable the United States Air Force to deliver combat air power to 9 unified commanders in NORAD. He brings an operator's perspective to this issue, having flown in combat in Iraq and commanded at many levels. If anyone on this panel must peer into the future on this important issue and strike just the right balance between manned and unmanned systems, it's General Gersten. Please join me in welcoming General Gersten.
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, first of all, say thank you for inviting me out to this venue, opportunity to hopefully answer some of your questions. To George's analogy of baseball, as a baseball player from the Air Force Academy, I was batting number 4 almost my entire 4 years there. I can never hold the number 2 position because that's typically reserved for the smarter, faster base stealers. So I'd like to move to the end of the table and pick up the bigger stick of what Buzz is going to work on. To the point of where I came from, it might seem strange in my introduction that I'm a programmer now. Before that, I was also a voracious consumer. As the wing commander of the 432nd Wing, the Air Force's lead RPA unit, I was a unbridled, uncaged consumer of Air Force top-end, joint force, equity, bandwidth. And so I understand from the consumer point of view how much it takes, referencing not only the technology but the people aspect of this. I would tell you that the gift that my commander gave me was to say, thank you, Guns, for your consumer approach towards RPAs. But now we're going to put you in the programming force and now balance out what you built. And this is one of the formidable challenges you'll see, and hopefully it'll come up in discussion. The title of this symposium, The Right Mix, is almost perfect, because what we seek is finding that balance. Where it sits today, whether General Dempsey's 80-20 kind of balance between what's programmed and what's open to us, or how we sit in the Air Force, particularly we're about 60% of our aircraft now looking towards remotely piloted or manned. Striking that balance is where I live day to day. And that is where we should all be focused on, because we certainly have to be very attuned to how we set our force structure in place for the future and how technology addresses that force structure support. Certainly, we cannot take a holistic economic approach. I would tell you as a military advisor to the COMAC, this is about risk as much as it is about survival on the economic environment. Be very sensitive to that. A lot of people will come into my office and tell me and sell me an efficient system. And my first question would be, is it effective? We have to watch the difference and balance between efficiency and effectiveness. Acknowledging the fact that it's not only a technology and a cultural change, it really is the difference between how people view the system. I would tell you that the 2 years of my command was largely focused on trying to convince the joint environment that it's not only the importance of the technology we bring to the battlefield, but the culture we're bringing to the air component of that joint force. The analogy I would use is my mother, who was a very traditional woman, would for years, up to probably about 5 or 10 years ago, refuse to buy a microwave. The microwave is not how you cook meals. In time now, she has now adjusted to the point that microwave is something you cannot do without in the kitchen. This is kind of the spiral approach we will probably be taking towards the adaptation of remotely piloted systems for the future. I would tell you that it's probably something that we cannot now do without, now we've found the utility, the effectiveness and efficiency of the system. Acknowledging those biases is what we have to appreciate as we move forward. I would tell you on a personal note, one of the things we are working very hard to do, and what I worked hard to do, and some of the people that I've worked with before, and some old friends and new friends, I would tell you we have to focus on the language. As we all know, words matter. Words matter more and more. This venue is very broad in its scope if we don't focus on different perspectives between what is unmanned and what is remotely piloted. From the Air Force's perspective and the system approach I will be bringing, I will address systems as remotely piloted. I know nothing about a UAV. I know everything about a remotely piloted system. We are looking very closely as we look at the efficiencies and effectiveness of the system that we're finding that the manpower, the human bill associated with remotely piloted aircrafts is as formidable as the manned bill. So be careful how we approach things and make sure we include everything in the discussion from tip to tail when we talk about being efficient in order to be effective to buy down risk. Thank you.
Thank you, General Gersten. Our next panelist brings the U.S. Army's perspective to this issue. Colonel Tim Healy is Division Chief for Mission Command and Awareness at the Army's Capabilities Integration Center in Fort Eustis, Virginia. Like General Gersten, Colonel Healy has flown and commanded in combat in Iraq and most recently in Afghanistan, but a little closer to the earth as a helicopter aviator flying the H-1 Cobra, the MH-6, and MH-60 Black Hawk. Now with the Army embracing UAVs so rapidly, many of them flying in the same airspace as the Army Aviation Unit pilots who were once Colonel Healy's junior officers were flying in today, I suspect he has strong and even passionate feelings regarding the right mix of systems to support troops on the ground from the air. Please join me in welcoming Colonel Healy.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. One of the big things I want to reach back to is General Dempsey's talk to us, and he said that 80% is already either purchased or programmed. Now, we all know that there is the ability to reprogram, but to try and reprogram things that are defense programs and going across the river to the people on Capitol Hill, that is a very, very daunting task to try and change something that is already budgeted. So there's really only about 20% that we know we've got a capability to reach out and potentially redirect or rapidly, dynamically retask, as we like to say. In the past 10 years, we have made significant strides and advancements in, as General Gersten was saying, they're not unmanned aerial vehicles, they're remotely piloted vehicles. As Dr. Friedman was talking about, with cruise missiles, those were unmanned, but they had a programmed position to go to, they went there, they accomplished their mission, and that was the end of it. So it was kind of a fire and forget, just like a regular dumb bullet. With a remotely piloted vehicle, one of the largest and most daunting tasks we have is the network bandwidth and reach back. For somebody to be sitting either at a forward base in Bagram or in Baghdad or someplace like that and flying a remotely piloted vehicle, that vehicle still needs to have connectivity back to that person to be able to wiggle the joystick and move it over the battlefield the way they want. As we have found in the last 10 years, the commander's quest for knowledge and information has grown exponentially, and what we have done is we have tried to do everything we can to give the commander on the ground whatever it is they need. What we need to start to look at is, do they really need all of this information? and how do we measure levels of expectation as we move forward from regular cameras to high definition to other sorts of things. What that does is significantly increases the bandwidth reach back. And that is probably the Achilles heel or the linchpin in all of this, is that when you put a piloted vehicle out on the battlefield, yes, they can find information, and that pilot determines what he sends back to his higher headquarters on the ground. Some of it may just go back directly. Some of it he can decide, this I can send back, this can wait till I get back on the ground. Whereas something that is remotely piloted, number one, all of that data has to come back that somebody on the ground has to be able to decipher. And also the operation of that air vehicle has to be network data linked back for somebody on the ground to operate it. We have done significant growth with Task Force Odin, Observe, Detect, Identify, and Neutralize, which we started in Iraq, and now we have in Afghanistan. And this is really cobbled together manned and unmanned systems in trying to get the right mix of how we want to move forward on the battlefield, realizing that there are going to be fiscal budget constraints, but even more important than the fiscal budget constraints are manpower, network, and capabilities. Because we have just increased what we can find in the last 10 years and what we can transmit and what information we can give the maneuver commander on the ground, but we have not yet figured out how to streamline that or to determine what is the most critical and what is something that can be pushed off the information superhighway, so to speak. And that's where you really get into the artificial intelligence. Until we develop a true artificial intelligence of being able to launch something autonomously as an unmanned system, and that it can go out and it can make those decisions, that a human being right now is the one who makes the determination on what to do and what not to do, what to pass and what not to pass. Until we can get to a true level of artificial intelligence, we are probably more in the realm of remotely piloted vehicles for the near term than unmanned aerial vehicles. I'll close with the most critical thing, as our moderator said, for me is, from an aviation perspective, from a pilot perspective, the old adage of big sky, little bullet. Well, if I'm out there flying an aircraft and there's all other aircraft out there that are being flown by other aviators, I know that they're out there seeing and avoiding just like I am. As you get down into some of the smaller UAVs or remotely piloted vehicles, the Shadow, the Raven, and some of the others, we have got to make sure that we educate our ground brethren that just launching one of these things because they've got a target they want to see on the ground could have unbelievable ramifications if there are other aircraft, rotary wing, in the airspace, and all of a sudden a Raven comes up, because big sky, little bullet is a little bit different when you're talking about a 7.62 or a 50 caliber round, or when you're talking about a remotely piloted vehicle that weighs 10 or 15 pounds running into a Kiowa Warrior or running into a Black Hawk. So we not only have to worry about making sure we get the information to the commander that they need, but we also need to educate the ground operators that are using these things. We don't need pilots in every one of these. We don't need the cost and the manpower that goes with that. And as I think all of us will realize, you know, the kids, and I hate to use the word kids, but the kids that are coming into the military today are probably a lot smarter and significantly more technically savvy than we were, or we even are now. And so we have to give them the benefit of making sure that we educate them on how best to utilize and implement these new technologies that we're producing for them on the battlefield, because they will probably amaze us in how they come about figuring better ways to integrate and utilize all these new systems. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Colonel Healy. It's not a stretch to say that since 9/11, the U.S. Special Operations Command, SOCOM, has been at the tip of the spear of what we do in our wars. Our final panelist brings that SOCOM perspective to this issue, and specifically how manned and unmanned systems support our special operators today and tomorrow. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Buzz Rempfer, U.S. Air Force, is Flight Commander, 2nd Special Operations Squadron, U.S. Air Force Special Operations Command. He's flown manned aircraft in combat and now commands his units flying the MQ-1B Predator missions. He is living the manned and unmanned mix on a daily basis today, and his insights provide a fitting bookend to the conversation that Dr. Friedman began to kick off this panel. Please join me in welcoming Lieutenant Colonel Rempfer.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful to be here with this fine group of panelists. I was also out at the West Conference last year where I was able to hopefully provide a little bit of the operator's perspective as far as UAVs go. To me, it comes down to preserving the national will. We've had the discussion. Our chairman mentioned UAVs during his talk. Certainly there's a lot of cost and capability advantages of unmanned systems as opposed to manned platforms, just from the perspective of how long they can remain in the air. And those time advantages, time to observe the folks on the ground, times to see situations developing, be there to have the situational awareness to respond, to protect the troops on the ground. My perspective is, having flown manned fighters for about the first dozen years of my Air Force career, I was never able to be there in a way that I have been able to since I've been flying UAVs. I think that's the most dramatic importance of the mission, that we're there for so long over the battle space and that we're able to actually be there when the troops need us. In my time doing close air support in F-16s and A-10s, I was able to be there for a pre-planned mission, but very seldom do you have the endurance to actually be there when things are going down on the ground. I throw out a couple vignettes. I shared one of them last year with the folks at the West Conference. I was flying over the Helmand a couple summers ago, and the 2-8 Marines were down there. And we knew that one of our friends from our hometown actually was in the 2-8 Marines and was deployed. And so my kids said, hey, see if you can find James out there. And I had no idea where the young man was deployed, but when I briefed up for a mission, I was actually, my supported unit, my customer, was the 2-8 Marines, and it just happened to be Echo Company, and I recognized that because I knew the unit that James was assigned to. And so I got on station that night, and I'm no kidding, working with Echo Company 2-8 Marines, and I'm able to talk to a Joint Terminal Attack Controller. I'm able to give him my remotely operated video enhancement receiver feed right down to him and a laptop down there on the ground. And I'm able to talk to him for a significant amount of time. And I finally figure it's okay to get a little bit personal, and I start talking to him about the guys in his unit. And I say, I think that I might know a Lance Corporal in your unit. By any chance, does this name sound familiar? And I shared the name with a guy. And he goes, he thought that sounded familiar, and that it was definitely Echo Company. And he gave me a target talk on down to the south of his position, about 80 meters to a pile of sleeping bags alongside of a compound. And he said, that's where your Lance Corporal is sitting. There's no way in my flying F-16s and A-10s or any other platform for the Air Force that I could have had the ability, little coincidence, but the ability to connect with the guys on the ground. Just this past year, we're getting troops out of Iraq. We're providing them oversight, overwatch. And I'm working with some of the vehicles up and down the highways south of Baghdad. And I have the time to connect with the guys in the operations center, pick their brains a little bit, find the radio frequencies for the trucks that I'm actually following in the convoys. Something I could never do when I was an F-16 guy, because I was too busy just trying to get situational awareness of what's going on, find the guys that I'm following. And in this case, I'm able to actually have a lengthy conversation with one of the convoy drivers, the lead guy. I'm able to talk to the guy. I'm able to learn where his hometown is. He tells me, this is the first time I've ever talked to an Air Force pilot. And, you know, I looked over to my sensor operator, and a young lady just looks at me and says, that was cool. You know, we're able to connect with the folks on the ground. And that's kind of my parting thought for you, but the most important thing I think I have to share is this paradox of these UAVs, that we're talking about extremely inexpensive platforms relatively. We're talking about platforms that stay airborne so much longer because they go so slow, are able to do their close air support capability so much better. And it's not necessarily a glamorous job for a pilot, but the paradox is it's the best mission I've ever participated in. It's the best contribution that I've ever been able to make. That's the paradox. And the ability to connect with the guys on the ground like we never have been able to before. It's the realization that it's not about the man flying the airplane. It's not about the hardware. It's about that connectivity to the people on the ground. And anything that we can take away from this as far as future cost advantages, the gentlemen here have mentioned just this basic concept of man in the loop. We are more in the loop than ever flying the UAV mission. I'm very grateful to have been able to do it for the past 6 years as a reservist. It's the best mission I've ever been involved in, and I think that's the evolution we have in air power, is we're truly realizing from an evolutionary pilot perspective, operator perspective, the most important objective, the most important goal is to protect those folks on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Remper. So there you have it, 4 completely different lenses looking at this important and compelling issue. Now, as promised, before we open it up to Q&A from all of you sitting there, we'd like to offer our panelists the professional courtesy to ask questions of their fellow panelists, not only establish a 2- or multi-way dialogue amongst themselves, or pile on to something one of your fellow panelists has said. So, gentlemen, anyone want to take the first move? We're good? Okay. More time for y'all.
I agree.
So, over to you, our delegates. We have about 20 minutes left for Q&A, and there are a lot of you out there. We know you have questions. So if you do have a question, please queue up behind one of the microphones on the floor you see here up front. And we'll identify you and ask you to ask your question. Please tell us who you are and what organization you represent. You can address your question to an individual panelist or to the panel in general, and if you do that, we'll try to figure out who's best equipped to answer it. And finally, as a courtesy to your fellow delegates, as I see a lot of people are queuing up already, please just ask a one-part question, and please do make it a question and make sure it's not a manifesto. So, ma'am, you first, please.
Janice Marconi, Marconi Works International. This is just a simple question. When do you go more low-key, such as when do you have a blimp versus something else, such as the blimps that are in Afghanistan? When do you have that as your platform?
Who wants to start that?
A blimp?
A blimp.
That's what
I get the impression there's a fear that they're too slow. Although there has been interest in them, the Army has bought a large one.
Yeah, there's
sorry. I think that people want the mobility. You want to be there a lot, but you don't want to be there so continuously that someone will take a pot shot. You might use it as a communications node. That might be well worth the effort.
I'll go ahead and address, because I understand what you're talking about in Afghanistan with the PSSTs and the things that we've got overhead on some of the FOBs, and the LEM-V, which is the emerging capability that everybody is talking about. One of the things that you've got to consider for that is determining on when to go low-key, if you want to call it that, is it depends on the threat environment. Obviously in Afghanistan, obviously in Iraq, we were in phase 4 operations. We definitively had command and control of the airspace. So putting a 300-foot blimp up at 20,000 feet that has 20 days of station time is something that we can do in an environment like that because we do control the airspace. In a more high-threat environment where we've got an enemy that's got the capability to reach into the 3rd dimension and reach high into the 3rd dimension, you're in a position where the ability for those types of platforms to survive is what probably makes the big determination. And that's where we do have to kind of get into the mix, because we have to look at the different phases of the operation to determine what type of system we use. Obviously, in a phase 3, in a high threat environment where we're going against a peer or near peer competitor, something like that is probably not going to have a high survivability rate. If we go into a phase 4, if we're previously in a phase 2 before open hostilities break out, is where you may be able to use those types of systems. So there does need to be a mix of systems. One size does not fit all, and unfortunately, as the defense budget starts to shrink, that is the biggest thing that we have to determine is not only, as General Gersten was saying, when somebody comes to him and says, you know, I've got something that is cost effective, okay, but is it cost efficient and it is capable of doing the mission that it's supposed to do? And that's where we're going to really come into some significant constraints as we move forward, because a lot of the things that we fielded in the last 10 years, we fielded with, you know, QRCs, quick reaction capabilities, OCO funding, other contingency operations, which are not coming out of the defense budget. Well, as we pull out of Afghanistan and OCO funding goes away in 14 or 15, you're going to get back into the position of, right now, a commander on the ground says he needs something, and somebody pulls out the checkbook and says, how big do I write it? 3 years from now, that's not going to be what you're going to get from the people up at the Pentagon.
Thank you, sir.
General Gersten or Colonel?
I've worked with folks that are providing feedback from the blimps that are overseas, providing overwatch over the forward operating bases. I've worked some pretty intense engagements that started because we had that intelligence, that surveillance capability. So it's an amazing asset to have over there. But as Colonel Healy mentions, it's completely dependent upon a permissive environment. But I think the point of blimps is good as far as the endurance. To me, it's all about time. It's about the time you have to develop a picture, the time you have to provide that surveillance. Imagine in a homeland defense, a civil support, a homeland security type arena where it may be difficult to actually have UAVs, RPAs, unmanned airplanes in the domestic airspace, but maybe we have the capability to have a blimp, some kind of a dirigible over a major metropolitan area to provide long-term surveillance, not just one-day loiter time, but like you say, you know, literally 3 weeks of loiter time during an emergency management type scenario. So there are incredible application for the blimp technologies.
Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, anything to add? Or?
No, I think that you hit the points. It's a requirements-based situation. Static versus dynamic targeting is the question at hand. Be careful of templating a environment which we operate in currently against a environment which is more like a jungle or three-dimensional surface. So angles count.
Daly?
My question is really a follow-on to that same theme. I'd like to hear from the panel members, have we learned the right lessons over the past 10 years with a set theater, with dedicated niche assets that feel good because they're dedicated to a certain particular mission? And does it translate well for the non-permissive environment, which we've kind of touched on just now, and especially an electronic warfare environment where they might not even have to hit the asset, they just, you know, deny? Thoughts?
Thanks.
I think that's a real problem, because a lot depends upon whether we believe that the future looks like Afghanistan and Iraq or whether it looks like something a lot nastier. If it looks a lot nastier, then a lot of what's been built for the permissive environment will suddenly go away, or should suddenly go away. And under the budget catastrophe that we expect, I think a lot of it will. I'm less worried about the EW problem, because I think of EW more as directed against specific platforms. In a lot of cases, the connectivity of the UAVs is going to be going up instead of down. It won't be that easy to get into those loops. I know that the Iranians made a lot out of claiming that they had jammed and then brought down that UAV that was operating over Iran. My guess is more that it lost connectivity and ran out of gas and just crashed itself, and that their achievement was rather more limited than they may imagine. My guess is that the unpermissive environment will push us towards much higher performance vehicles, probably fewer of them. I don't think we can avoid having them, and the kind of warfare that we're building, which I call network-centric, requires so much surveillance on such a protracted basis that I don't think you can avoid having large numbers of unmanned vehicles. I just don't think they'll be the ones you're seeing now. And the fact that they were built on contingency basis meant there's not that much logistical depth to them. It means that a lot of the manufacturers don't have a lot of depth and probably can't maintain them for very much longer. And you probably see a lot of this swept away. So when you hear the statistics about very large numbers of unmanned vehicles in the Defense Force, I think that may turn out to be somewhat more deceptive than we imagined. Unfortunately, actually.
I would simply comment that they're not going to go away. Okay, these, like the microwave, it's going to be in your kitchen for a long time. These UAVs or these RPAs will be in your kitchen for a long time. Just because we choose not to engage a force in a permissive environment, we move out of the central region in the counterinsurgency operation, we focus maybe some of our intellectual capital into a more high-tech threat, doesn't mean that we don't have to fight in that environment. There's a vote, and they vote too. And we'll continue to focus on the region we're in. That's where this aircraft has a niche, because it can operate in a permissive environment, and we'll have to maintain that capability there to continue to protect ourselves as we focus to different threats throughout the globe. It's not a situation of have or have-nots. It's a situation of budgeting and balancing what we can do. So I think that it's not going away anytime soon. It's just they're going to be adjusted. We'll adjust them with technology advancements to adhere to a permissive environment, non-permissive environment, or a largely foliage or non-foliage environment.
Colonel Healy?
The big point that you brought out and General Dempsey mentioned today is the defense planning guidance that came out before the 13-17 budget or POM was submitted. But back in January, what a lot of people may or may not be aware of is there was an emerging guidance that came out from Secretary Panetta, and it was introduced by the President and by Secretary Panetta back the first or second week in January, which basically came out and said, we will not do a long-term, large-scale, Phase 4 type operation in the future. That is not our focus. We will do a Phase 4 if we have to, but it will be a short duration and rapidly turned over to NGOs or other government agencies, or it will require a large-scale mobilization of reserve forces to keep it going. So I don't think that we're going to we've learned some great lessons in the last 10 years, but as the American military has always seemed so great to do, is we're awesome at fighting the last war. Well, I think Secretary Panetta and the President have made it pretty clear to us that our focus is not going to be another Iraq or Afghanistan in the future, and we need to plan accordingly for that.
Colonel Renfrew?
As far as the permissiveness of the environment to the original question, I think that even if most of the current MQ-1, MQ-9 technologies are limited as far as being able to operate in a high-threat environment, we still have the balance, the mix of other assets in order to turn a high-threat environment into a more permissive environment where we have air supremacy. So there's going to be a place for those assets literally in any conflict. And then I also wanted just to comment as far as the productivity issues. We've got the significant increases in the numbers of these airplanes, of the RPAs in the Air Force, the Predators and the Reapers. But there's another dimension to the increase in the number of airplanes. Not only do we have a lot more of those airplanes, but literally all of those airplanes almost are actually operating in the AOR. And literally all of the RPA pilots are participating in combat operations in the AOR. And they're not just all participating in those operations periodically, deploying once every 3 or 4 years for 3 or 4 months. They're doing it nonstop. So I think it's an important additional perspective to have, that the platforms and the operators are continuously engaged in the operations, and that is unheard of in the manned aircraft environment.
Commander, I think you're next.
Thank you, sir. Lieutenant Colonel Dan Lachance, I'm a pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Colonel Healy briefly mentioned artificial intelligence, and that's my question. In the future, how do you envision the right mix between manned and unmanned systems when UAVs will be truly autonomous agents capable of making their own battle decisions and won't need to be controlled? You won't have a problem with bandwidth and all that good stuff.
A simplistic answer is we don't know what we don't know. and we've all talked about artificial intelligence, but until we actually have a true capability that we can put physically into use and see what the capability is and what the ability of that platform and system is to replace the manually controlled or manually operated systems, we won't know how well that they can be integrated. My personal feeling is that we will never get to the point where it will be a completely autonomous, artificially intelligent system that is operating. There will still be a human somewhere in the chain that will make the decision to launch, to recover, to launch a strike from, or something like that. It will hopefully significantly reduce those manpower requirements, but until we really get the maturation of the technology for it to actually demonstrate itself, it's kind of hard to sit here and say 80%, 20%, 40%, 60%, but I still think it will never be 100%, 0%.
May I comment on that? Look at the missile world, because in some cases, missiles actually do select their own targets, right? There's target-seeking missiles. The reason you don't want totally autonomous unmanned vehicles is that you have to have responsibility for a decision to blow something up or kill somebody. And as you go towards a more netted type of system in which planning is done on a collaborative basis, it becomes more difficult to assign responsibility, which is a real problem. I don't think you'll ever see a completely autonomous choice in attacking an ambiguous target. No one would even think about, well, I launched my anti-ship missile, it found the ship and blew it up. I mean, that's not the future, that's about 30 years ago, right? That's been around for a long time. So the issue is about deciding to attack something which is not an obvious target. You've already got things that are supposed to find targets that are clear. You've even got devices that are supposed to find individual vehicles. They don't work terribly well. So when you talk about what might happen in some indefinite future, if instead of talking about UAVs and what they do, think about the missile world, and I think it'll be much clearer what's going on. And by the way, what you shouldn't do.
Let me just jump in and piggyback. Tim's answer is exactly correct. We don't know what we don't know. But I would tell you this, from the perspective I'm sitting at the completion of the development of artificial intelligence will be the beginning of the development of artificial morality.
Colonel, anything else?
Not a bad way to say it.
Just if it's okay, just to pile on what some of the other panelists are and just bring something that came up in the National Defense University Conference last week about this subject. They talked about artificial intelligence. If you look at that as sort of a stretch goal, I think the thing that they were most focused on, and probably of most importance to our industry partners to what to go back and work on, is they really emphasized that the era of one person, one joystick, one unmanned system is unsustainable. So that's probably a road along the way to exactly what you brought up, sir. I'm not sure who was next here, sir. If you've still got a question, you were sitting down with your apple, or...
Yeah, it's very hard to take notes on the smart things folks are saying when I'm balancing it on one arm.
That's okay.
But I want to push on Admiral Daly's question. I mean, we have these extraordinary capabilities, and, you know, just as moving to mechanized forces in the 30s and 40s created a huge vulnerability and logistical tail of getting the fuel and the spare parts forward that, you know, horses and guys on foot didn't have. Now we have this huge invisible tail of electronic communications and all the satellites, the ground stations, the bandwidth requirements. You know, in that, you know, those non-permissive environments, which may not look like, you know, may not be that there's an integrated air defense system, but there may just be an enemy like, you know, the hybrid threat that may have, you know, the Hezbollah-like foe, or things Chinese are experimenting with, that may not be able to challenge us traditionally in the air, but that has advanced, cyber EW capabilities that create, new kinds of problems. What are the new vulnerabilities, and how do we address them before someone else exploits them?
Sir, excuse me, since we're capturing this on video, could you identify yourself?
Oh, sure. I'm Sidney Friedberg from AOL Defense.
Okay,
so an online publication. We're aware of bandwidth issues.
Okay, thank you for that.
Well, in case you think that not having the unmanned vehicles solves the problem, if the target on the ground is very obvious, then a pilot can see it by the way you could send a missile out to blow something up if you can identify in some external way what it is. The issue comes up when you're receiving communications from reconnaissance, when you're trying to support a dynamic battle environment. Guess what? It'll stick everybody. And it's not clear that it's really a new vulnerability. I think it became a vulnerability as soon as you had airplanes that weren't tied by a wire to somebody on the ground saying, I want to destroy that thing now. As far as the idea that it used to be really easy to fight on the ground before the tanks needed all the gas, if you study a large cavalry army, you discover that they had a rough time too. It was just a differently rough time. The horses get sick, they have to eat, the fodder is not available everywhere, and you suddenly discover that it was never good. The golden time was never. So we're always stuck. The Chinese talk endlessly about ruining our communications and our reconnaissance. This is their asymmetric warfare. Well, it's what everyone would do in a case of network-centric. Of course you go after electronics. And if we're dumb enough not to cover our comms and to try hard to beat jamming, we deserve what we get. But that's a much broader problem than UAV land. That's everything now. You kill our comms, you kill our reconnaissance, it's over. And it would be over whether there were manned vehicles or not. We'd be stuck.
Thanks. Anyone else want to take that one on?
There's nothing new about what your question is. It's not invisible, it's tangible, it's measurable, it's been identified. Logistics tails have always been vulnerable. If they're worth defending, they're worth attacking. There's no difference between horses, oats for your horses, or satellite pairs for your RPAs. It's been the Achilles heel of every fielded army or in the history of our time. You have to defend it, and we will.
On a positive note, as far as, of course, we'd have to have redundancies in the system. Part of that is the way the architectures of the remotely piloted aircraft fleet can operate. We could have one node per se that would go down, but the fortunate thing is based on the distributed nature of the system. It is a system, truly. You could have the folks in North Dakota that are for some reason unable to control their airplane any longer. The guard guys in Arizona could pick it up for them. The guys in Ohio could do it if the guys in Arizona couldn't. So there's some amazing flexibilities to the distributed nature of the weapon system that it's also unparalleled compared to what we've seen in the past.
Admiral Riley?
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you for providing your services in support of this pretty timely panel. Dr. Friedman, your comments about cruise missiles made me think about the Tomahawk Block 4 variant, which can be reprogrammed in flight, and where you have both the Charlie variant with the unitary warhead and the Delta variant with submunitions, which is another tool in the kit bag. My question stems from what we all know is a shift in our strategic focus to the Pacific and to these ongoing discussions about air-sea battle concept. And I guess my question is perhaps more for Captain Galderisi and Dr. Friedman, and I should say I'm a retired Naval Surface Warfare Officer and I work for SAIC. We've concentrated a little bit on the A variant of unmanned systems. We've talked about unmanned air vehicles, our aerial vehicles or remotely piloted vehicles. I would welcome your comments on where you might see the future as it bodes for UUVs, unmanned underwater vehicles, and also unmanned surface vessels.
May I speak to that?
Please.
It's a different business, but very, very important. If you look at submarines and surface ships, the numbers are many fewer than they should be, and over a very large area, they get distributed rather thinly, and that's a Pacific issue. What you can see in submarines is that UUVs expand the footprint of the submarine remarkably. They certainly favor larger subs that can support more of them. You can certainly get interested in using them for reconnaissance over a larger area. If you value submarine reconnaissance, and I think we should, then you would much rather put a small UUV closer in where it can listen than a large submarine where the submarine part of it is going to be listening and then analyzing the data. Well, you can analyze the data further back when the UUV comes back. The future issue is comms underwater. If you can do comms underwater, and you know that that's coming and it seems to get better, but you don't know how much better, then you get interested in combat UUVs. That gives you another interesting possibility for expanding your footprint, for covering a larger area with the same kind of capability. And you probably know that Newark was pushing that very hard some years ago, and I think it was a very interesting idea. As far as USVs go, the issue is going to be how well they behave in a rough sea. I mean, normally you like a large hull because water is, bounces around. I've seen them pushed very hard for security in port. I certainly think that USVs would have made life rougher for the people who attacked the coal. They have been pushed for other jobs, for example, for remote sonar at a distance, but I don't know how well they behave in rough water. If you look at the LCS, it's basically a platform to support unmanned vehicles of all sorts. And the idea is that somehow it's the processing node, they spread out the sensors. If you wanted to do ASW in shallow water, spreading out sensors on the bottom is a real good way to go. You're not going to do that with a million small ships because you can't afford them. So it's got to be something unmanned. And in that sense, I'm not a great fan of the current LCS because I think the speed is ridiculous, but I am a great fan of the modular aspect of it. I think it should have more modules. Yeah, they're terribly important. But they don't fly, so they're not filled with sex appeal, so what can you do?
Maybe, sir, just to pile on modestly what Dr. Friedman said, I mean, I think it's not my opinion, it's what the DoD Unmanned System Master Plan says. Just because the aviation side of the house is ahead of the other domains doesn't mean that the other two are any less important. And I think there's great value and future in surface and underwater systems. I think for folks in industry, just using the LCS as an example, I think where we in the services need the most help is to understand that, particularly in the domain you grew up in with the LCS, where it's up, down and out. I think some of the early plans for some of the modules were, okay, great, we're going to have an unmanned aerial system, unmanned surface system, unmanned underwater system for this module. Oh, and oh, by the way, they're all going to be built by different companies. And oh, by the way, they're all going to have separate consoles and separate software and separate operators. I think that's unsustainable going in. There just aren't enough bunks on an LCS. So I think that's where we, in my opinion, in the service need the most help, understanding that you only have a limited number of square feet, cubic feet, operators on these. So let's make sure they're all operated by the same person.
Great, thank you.
I should add one more thing, and I feel foolish for not having said this. If you look at the cost of many surface ships, a lot of effort goes into reducing signatures. I'm not talking about stealth, I'm talking about acoustic and magnetic signatures. If a lot of what goes into a forward place where they're going to be vulnerable is unmanned, you can concentrate on the unmanned vehicle. That allows you to go for a less expensive surface ship. You see that in a lot of people pushing what they call dog on a leash mine hunting devices. But obviously you can go a lot further. Also, if you go unmanned, you can do a lot of jobs in parallel rather than in series. I'm thinking now of mine hunting. you might actually imagine clearing minefields, or at least exploring minefields much more rapidly. Oh boy, would that make a difference. And we're already doing that to some extent with mine reconnaissance from subs. So there are jobs which really can't be done any other way. Or if they could, you'd never do them because you wouldn't last 5 minutes. And in that sense, you might almost get more mileage out of the unmanned underwater vehicles than almost anything else.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I believe you're up next.
Good morning, gentlemen. Commander Sue Dalton from ComNav Airlant here in Norfolk. I think my question is primarily for General Gersten, but all the panel, if you have any comments. As each force develops their own UAV, RPA, whatever you want to call it today, version, and this question comes from, I had a tour of the 480th ISR squadron at Langley and saw the techs there processing the Predator feeds and how excellent a job they were doing there, and it was just, I was just very proud to be in the military, seeing them do their jobs and basically processing for those people who war fighters sitting in Langley. I was thinking, why don't, my question is, are we going to do this, but why don't we centralize our processing of all the incredible feeds 24/7, you know, the bandwidth issues into one or duplicated source and maybe one force, and make this an expertise, and since this is a Joint Warfighting Conference, do it jointly. And I think we're right now at that tipping point where we're determining a lot of these things. And is that being done? Is that being looked at? And if so, you know, who's predominantly winning that?
Colonel Renfrew, do you want to start that off? Because we were talking about Creech Air Force Base as the center of excellence.
My perspective on the joint nature of it goes no further than we've got some excellent ex-Marine Corps and Navy guys in our unit. But I'll defer to General Gersten as far as the future joint initiatives.
I would say that is a key and critical question that you ask. There's a bumper sticker floating around DC or amongst the RPA community is that we're drowning in data and we're starving for information. There is an onslaught of data, raw data, hitting the floors that we can't get to because of the efficiency of the process that you speak of, the 480th being the one that has to process all of this data. As we continue to head down this path, we do not have to or want to be a sole service-centric approach towards vetting all of this data and turning it into decision quality information. We have been challenged through all of our organizations inside the Air Force specifically to find a way to incorporate joint data and information requirements and then bring it to a central region of vetting so we can get that data converted to information. Formidable, extremely formidable approach. And if there's ever a beta of what will drive a joint requirement, it sits in the remotely piloted environment. I'm agnostic to how the information comes in. I could really care less if it's a dirigible, if it's an MQ-1, or if it's an RQ-170. We should all be agnostic to that. It's what you do with that that makes a difference. That's where the power of this information comes from. We've got to get our hands around it. And as to your question of who's doing it, we have a huge, our AFISRA is really driving hard to get to that, to bring it underneath the Air Force hat, but it's really got to be a joint environment. And we need to get to that. You'll hear folks like General Cartwright and General Deptula speak to the joint approach to getting at this information. But it's a great question.
Yes, sir. And just an add-on that I don't think any of us really care if we save a Marine Corps life or an Air Force life or a Navy life, as long as we're getting the information as quick as we can. And with the limited money we have, let's just throw the whole, individual force thought process away and go joint and go fast.
John Dempsey alludes to that in the mission center that serves a joint purpose, joint as in sequential, not in sequential, but in a massive parallel effort.
Yes, sir.
I think we have time for one more question. Commander, you're up.
Thank you. And Mike Amos from Naval Air Forces Atlantic. Question stems from the very topic of this forum. manned, unmanned, what's the right mix, and to whether or not we should take another look at that, and whether manned, unmanned teaming is potentially a solution in the future to controlling the data stream, and also to going into areas where we may be denied with that data. Looking for the panel's opinions or future direction with manned and unmanned teaming.
I can speak to that from the Army perspective, and the Army is doing significant work in trying to get to the manned-unmanned teaming concept. We've already started it with our Kiowa Warrior Fleet, and one of the squadrons has actually been constructed to 3 air troops of Kiowa Warriors and 1 troop of Shadow UAVs. And they are in the same organization. They work for the same boss. They go out and work on the same missions. And one of the other people who's sitting in the audience here was explaining to me some things from last night. He's the head aviation trainer at the NTC. And when 217 CAV came out, the biggest thing that they did was in the integration of the manned-unmanned teaming is that they're all part of one organization. When you do the mission briefs, you've got the manned pilots sitting right next to the remotely piloted operators, and they're going through the same mission brief. They're getting the exact same mission brief from the leadership. They're asking the questions. They're sitting right next to each other, picking each other's brains, and when they go out to do it, they're doing a much better job than it's great to have manned systems in one location and you bring a remotely piloted vehicle from another location, but until you actually bring those people together, and it doesn't physically, with what we've got the capabilities of today, they don't physically have to be sitting in the same room. You could have somebody sitting at Creech Air Force Base and somebody sitting at Bagram Air Force Base. But if they're going through the same mission brief together and then going out and executing the mission, that is, you know, the best way to do it. Again, it gets back to that linchpin we've all talked about, is the bandwidth issue. If they're not physically sitting together, then you've got to have bandwidth to set that up. So probably the big key to all of this that we're talking about is the information highway that we're going to have to significantly increase for us to be able to take full utilization and benefit from all of these great new systems that we're developing and coming up with.
I'm getting the high sign that I think we're all that's standing between you all and lunch. I think we need to wrap up our panel. So please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in thanking our panelists for sharing their thoughts today.